Hello, welcome to Exotic Ghana UK Yacht Weekly. Hopefully, somebody can hear me. Hello, welcome. Right, we've gone to plan B as the first plan didn't work. I was going through YouTube Direct, and now I'm going through some other software. So hopefully, fantastic, loud and clear. Thank you, Steve. Right, we shall begin. So, in this live episode, I just want to talk about overwintering. And I want to talk about your thoughts about plants that might need overwintering that you've not overwintered before. And if there's any questions you have about the whole overwintering process, please type away and I'll answer straight away, hopefully. So I know I've seen lots of people on Facebook asking questions about digging up plants and overwintering plants. And I suppose if you've not done it before on certain plants, you might be anxious. Obviously, you spent a lot of money on your plants and looked after them all year, and you don't want them to die over winter. So you might be thinking, it's time to overwinter plants now. Well, hopefully you've seen my sort of monthly videos where I talk about jobs for the garden. And in September, I talked about getting the most tender plants in. So the really tropical plants, the house plants, bringing those into undercover. And generally, yes, that's a good thing to do. But actually, September was a fantastic month and it was really warm throughout the month. And now in October, we've had some great days. And you don't need to bring in all your plants too early. In fact, the later you can bring plants in, the better overall, because the less disturbance they have, the less stress they'll go under, and the more likely that they'll survive. So before I go on further, just talking away to myself, obviously, if you've got any questions, please put them in the comments feed that you can see by the side of the video. And also, just to say, my internet here is pretty poor, so I can't get good upload speeds. So the quality of the graphics won't be very, very good. But hopefully you can hear me nice and clearly, and hopefully you'll get some feedback from the questions and hear my answers. So we have got a question from Steve, and he's talking about cannas. Can I cut my cannas down rather than wait until the first frost as I need to use the pots? So I'm assuming, Steve, you're talking about you've got your cannas growing in pots and you want to take them out of the pots to put something else in those pots over winter. I mean, you can cut your cannas down now. I mean, the weather's, it's not going to be frosty for some time yet, so you're still going to get a bit of life out of your cannas. And if they're still flowering, then they'll continue flowering until the first frost. If they're looking a bit worse for wear already, if they're nowhere near flowering, then you could start the overwintering process now. And I've talked about the different methods of overwintering cannas in my overwintering cannas video, which has been pretty popular recently. And that video I filmed last December. So it wasn't until December last year that I actually dug up cannas and brought them into the greenhouse for overwintering. And I still left cannas, in December. I was still collecting the seed in December. I was still dividing them and bringing them into pots into the greenhouse as well. And I left lots of cannas in the ground as well. And I put some mulch over most of those just to protect them. Because cannas are sort of plants that in most sort of mild winters, you would think they're completely hardy because they get cut down to the ground by the frost, and then the rhizomes just sit there over winter, and then they'll come back the next year with no issues. But they're not totally hardy. If you live in an area where you get really deep penetrating frosts, or it's really wet in winter, followed by lots of frost and ice, then they will rot away if it's a cold winter. You can sort of mitigate this by putting straw or old compost or anything over the surface where the cannas were growing. So you cut down all the frosted dead foliage, then you put your mound of leaves or straw or whatever you're going to use over the top, nice thick layer if you can, and then that will sort of insulate it like a blanket so it won't get too cold. And frost, you might get frost on the ground surface, but that frost and that ice won't actually work its way into the ground and into those rhizomes. That's what you're trying to protect. If it's a really, really wet year, even if it's not too cold, and you live in an area where it's basically waterlogged soil in winter, where you planted your cannas, they can still rot away. Nothing to do with the cold, just because it's been so long been dormant and really, really wet. So you want to basically grow them in an area where they're not going to be sat in water over winter. Obviously, you can bring cannas in, like I've shown, by digging up a whole clump. And I like to dig up cannas mainly where I want nice sort of foliage, like my Cleopatras, which I don't have too many of. I dig those up so that they have a better start the next year, so that you can start them in a greenhouse or in a temporary polytunnel or a little sort of corner where it's a bit warmer, and they'll get into growth earlier than if you just left them in the ground. When you leave them in the ground, they can stay fine all winter if they've been protected or in a mild location. But because you've got to wait for that earth to warm up, which might not be till April and May, it can be a long time before you see the first shoots and the first leaves. Whereas if you've dug them up, you've got a chance to maybe divide them, and then you've got a chance to keep them a bit warmer early in spring for them to grow, and they will get bigger earlier. So that's a bit about cannas. Got a question here from Skadgius, I think that's how you pronounce it. Would you leave your dahlias in the ground or dig them up? Now, that's basically down to, again, location. They're sort of hardy as cannas, give or take. You can leave cannas in the ground, but in bad winters, you might lose them. Or if you know you're in a really cold area, you might lose them. And slugs and snails do get to them very early in the year. And actually, the little slugs that actually live in the soil can eat away the tubers if it's really wet ground as well, and where they've softened and started to rot. So you might want to dig them up. I found here, where we don't normally get lower than -7, -8 at worst, normally about -3 to -5, that leaving them in the ground, they've always come back. I've never lost never lost dahlias in the ground, so I just leave them as they are, and I protect them with a bit of straw, roll compost, or just even getting the earth from that area and just sort of mounding it up where the crown of the dahlias are. That again insulates them like it does with cannas. And obviously, it's quite easy if you've got like a big area. Once you've lost all the foliage and the leaves, you might forget where your plants are for next year, and you might stick a spade and dig through them the following spring. So it's a good idea to put some sort of cover, like a stone or a stick, where the middle of your cannas or your dahlias are, so you remember not to dig them up the following year. Let's see what else we've got here. Let's scroll back through the questions. So we've got a question about Frogmenses. So Frogmenses, they can be treated quite harshly over winter, to be honest. I've not done a video specifically on overwintering Frogmenses, but they can be treated in a number of different ways. So perhaps we'll do a dedicated video for them. The easiest way is basically you can either dig them up if you've had them in the ground, or if you've had them in a pot, just bring them under cover. But before you do that, you can basically chop off all the foliage and chop off a bit of the new growth. You just got the hardwood growth or the semi-ripe growth. And benefits of doing that is you get rid of all the bugs that might be brought in if you leave all the foliage in. And you often get, if you get it all in full leaf, it might look fine for a few weeks in your greenhouse or conservatory, but they drop a lot of leaves over winter. They get lots of pests. And also you can get sort of, I found when I brought them into the greenhouse here, the staining where the leaves have touched the walls, sort of obviously water comes out, and you can sometimes get a bit of staining from the leaves as well. Like I said, they fall off and they'll start sort of leaving marks on the ground and things if you don't clear them up. So with Frogmenses, if you don't want them growing over winter, so if you've got it somewhere either dark or sort of 5 to 10 degrees, even at a push down to freezing, you can sort of cut back to a frame of hardwood and semi-ripe sort of stems and keep them dormant, don't water them over winter, and they'll come through really well that way, and then you'll get new growth off the old wood in spring. You can sort of keep the whole plant going. If you want to see the flowers and you don't want to lose flowers over winter, then you can bring the whole plant in, but you've got to deal with the pests, the fallen leaves, and you've got to remember to water it and everything like that over winter. So you might, I don't know if anybody saw, it was about 2 or 3 years ago, there's a chap on Gardener's World who kept loads of Brugmansias, and he literally treated them really bad. He dug them all up. I think he grew them on an allotment. He chopped off all the foliage, just had literally the vertical main trunk and a sort of few sort of hardwood stems coming off. And he just stuck them in, I think he stuck them in a shed over winter. And I think it was in quite a mild location, so it wasn't really down to freezing where he lived. And then they grew the next spring and they did really well that way. I think if you mollycoddle plants too much, they get stressed over winter because there's not enough light and heat, and they're more prone to disease, and they're just more effort to get through that way. I think if you treat them cooler and cut the leaves off, they actually do better in spring. So, and obviously Brugmansias, you can take cuttings really easily as well. So you could do some cuttings over winter, root them in a glass of water, and have lots of plants for the following season as well. What else do we have here? Overwintering alocasias and colocasias. Okay, so I grow lots of colocasia, mainly pink chinas, which you've probably seen in my videos I leave in the ground. I think if you've got an established clump of pink china, then you can leave them in the ground, straw mulch over the top, and they'll come back every year. I've been growing them like that for over 10 years now, and they've always come back. You normally get 1 or 2 that go mushy and do rot away, but you'll have a clump of 5, 6, 7 little basically bulbs, and most of them will get through the winter. Other colocasias are tender types, which we've talked about, the Hawaiian ones, the really sort of striking foliage, variegated ones, speckled ones. They're more likely to rot away in winter because they don't produce massive bulbs. They're just tiny little things. So you haven't got much to overwinter as either dry stored, and you definitely can't leave them out in the ground because they need temperatures really above 10 degrees all the time because they are truly tropical plants. So those you sort of got to keep as a houseplant over winter, and as the light levels fall, they'll probably go down to 1 leaf by sort of end of winter. Or you can keep them in cooler temperatures, sort of like 10, 15 degrees, 10 degrees in a greenhouse if it's heated, or conservatory, but put them on a heat mat or put them in a propagator. So then they've got bottom heat, so the roots are nice and warm. Doesn't matter if the foliage is sort of 5, 10, 15 degrees. As long as those roots are nice and warm and the compost, then they'll come through nicely. Alocasias are different. Alocasias can look really good for a year or two, and then they can get smaller and smaller if they don't have ideal conditions. So most alocasias you get are normally bought as houseplants, and over time they'll sort of produce a trunk. Well, call it a trunk. It's sort of the rhizom's gone bigger and bigger and bigger, and the leaves get sort of grow from the top of that if you keep it for a number of years. And that tuber, trunk, bulb, whatever we're going to call it, that in itself can be dry stored over winter, and you can do that with pretty much all alocasias. The only trouble with dry storing alocasias is it's really hard to get them going again in spring. So you need to really put them somewhere really warm, ideally like 35 degrees, quite a bit of water, lots of heat, lots of light, and they will burst into growth. But if you stick them on about room temperature 15 to 20, maybe even 25 degrees, they'll sit there for months and take ages to get growing again. So you need to really boost the heat in spring if you're going to dry store alocasias. The other way is keeping them in a cool room or a properly heated greenhouse or a conservatory, and they'll lose, most of them will lose most leaves by the end of winter, but they'll be ticking over, they won't be dormant, and then come spring they'll grow away nicely. The trouble with alocasias is if you let them go dormant, you've got to give it that big boost of heat to get them going again in most cases. So really you want to keep them as a proper house plant in the house, so it's, you know, might not drop down to lower than 15 degrees too much overnight, and then daytime temperatures you'd be looking at, depending on how much you put your heating on, at least 20, 22 or 3 degrees, something like that. I don't have too many alocasias at all, to be honest, because I found once they go dormant, you've got to spend that much time sort of really heating them up in spring to get them going again. By the time they're big enough to plant out, which I like to do with most of my plants, they're not that large. So I've sort of gave away pretty much all my alocasias. Let's have a look. What else have we got? So Martin Turner asks about Trachycarpus palms. Should I net up my potted Trachycarpus palm? I'm assuming you mean sort of protect it over winter. If it's potted, I would, if you can, bring it against the house, but it's a Trachycarpus palm, so Trachycarpus fortunei is really, really hardy. So as long as we don't get an absolutely terrible long sub-zero period for like a week or two, then they'll be completely fine in a pot. I've had seedlings, 1-2 leaf seedlings of Trachycarpus fortunei, completely frozen through in tiny little pots, and they're completely unblemished come spring. They're really hardy. What they can't deal with is being frozen through for so long that they literally can't uptake water into the leaf, so they basically die of drought rather than cold. So the winter of 2010, when we had sub-zero day and night for 2 solid weeks, some of my potted palms just died because they couldn't get the water, and hardy bamboos died as well that were in pots that were left to be completely frozen through for so long. So you don't need to protect Trachycarpus palms at all unless you get an extremely cold winter, or you live in an area, you might be viewing this from Central Europe, where it gets, you know, below -15 for a long time, then you would need to protect it in those cases. But generally speaking, in sort of the most of the UK, you don't need to protect Trachycarpus at all in the ground or in a pot. Horticultural fleece for Mujabajus. So basically, you're trying to use as much as you think you're going to need, and that is affordable as well. I know that sounds a bit vague, but every stem of Mujabaju has some protection in itself. You're trying to protect the middle of the stem where the growth will be the next year. So the outer layers might get damaged and die, but the inner layers will survive. So you've got a bit of natural insulation and protection. Every bit of fleece you might put round, or as I prefer to do, I like to use straw, build a cage round, put straw in, and then put a cover of plastic on the top just to stop water coming in. I use a massive cage of straw around it, and that just insulates it. Again, it's a bit like the duvet thing, stopping frost penetrating through. But even just the stems of Mujabaju just out in the open ground, they'll take -4 quite easily, as long as it's not for a long period of time. So you might have a night -4, the next day it'll get to 3 or 4, 5, 6 degrees plus, and then it'll be fine. It won't completely die through. If you're growing Mujabaju by obviously the coast or inner cities, or even if you live somewhere pretty cool, but you have your plants by the house, in the house wall, there'll be enough radiated heat from the house to stop you even needing to protect Mujabaju. I had a huge clump of Mujabaju that I had by my front window at the front of the house, and it's even last winter where we had -7 and the Mujabaju in the open in the back of the garden, which it didn't protect at all. Most of the stems went down to ground in spring. The clump by the house didn't get any protection, and every single stem survived the winter, and that was down to -7. So it just shows you getting protection by a house can really sort of benefit your plants and give an extra layer of sort of invisible protection. You're not putting any sort of fleece, bubble wrap, or anything over or around your plants. You've just got the warmth of the house. And if you're south facing or east facing is great in winter, because in winter, when you've got the sun rising from the east, obviously, it'll melt that frost away much earlier on the east-facing areas compared to even the south and the west-facing areas. So you'll only get sub-zero or frosty on plants for the minimal amount of time if it's sunny in the morning and it's east-facing. So let's have a look what else we've got. So heated propagator, I use Vitapods or Vitapod propagators. I've had 2 over the last, I think, I want to say about 8-9 years. So one thermostat failed in that time, which is separate to the actual the heated propagator. That's the only one I have now is a heated propagator. It keeps ambient temperatures, or it can keep temperatures above ambient by about 12 to 15 degrees. So you might see when you're buying a propagator, heats up to 20 degrees or heats up to 30 degrees. If you put your propagator in a shed and it's 0 degrees and you put that on, it will never heat up to 30 degrees, even though it says so on the side. It will go up to 30 degrees max when it's at sort of room temperature, and then the electric element underneath will give it that boost of 5, 8, 10 degrees above ambient to get it up to that quoted temperature. So the Vitapod goes easily up to, I think, 35 degrees, because if you keep it in room temperature of 20, get your 15 degree up on that, and then you get up to your 35, which is great for starting a lot of banana seeds and really tropical seeds. So Vitapod is one I use because you have the different layers as well. You can get the base, and it comes in different plastic layers. You can get different heights. You have all the vents on as well, so it's completely controllable. And some cheaper propagators, you might notice if you feel the base of it when you've had it on for a while, you have one really hot spot where it's nice and warm, and then the rest of it might be cool or cold because the heating element in the base doesn't really cover the full area of your propagator, which defeats the object really. You want it to be, the heat to be evenly distributed, and when you sow your seeds, if it's not evenly distributed, you'll get great germination in one area where it's been nice and warm, and the edges normally, or one section where it's been cold, where there's no heating element underneath, you'll see the won't germinate half as well. So you want a really good propagator if you want even germination, and that's why I use a Vitapod, because it's really good heating element in there, and it's lasted for years. What else? Ricinus seeds. So ricinus seeds are interesting. If you've grown your ricinus plants, obviously from seed in spring, and you've had a good, strong, sunny year, nice warmth, and you've got your plants growing well, and they've flowered early, and they've had time for the seeds to develop, you will find at this time of year and the next few weeks that those prickly sort of pods look a bit like sea urchins. If you open them, you'll have big, fat castor oil beans, castor oil seeds, and those can be dried, kept until next year and sown. Obviously, as everybody knows, castor oil ricinus plants are extremely poisonous. If you're handling the seeds or you're taking them off, then you can either wear gloves or wash your hands really well afterwards. Don't start squeezing open seed pods and then squirting sap in your eye or rubbing your eyes or your mouth or anything like that, because you don't want to poison yourself. And so by telling the ready, basically you wait sort of till it sort of splits easily in your hand, and you'll see the beans, the seeds aren't soft. They'll sort of be a bit harder, and they'll be ready to basically pick up and dry for winter, and for, inside, obviously, dry them and then sow them next spring. And you can also find, I've found when I've just left the plants out, if I've not had a good growing year, then they won't set seed. The seeds will be immature and you won't actually get seeds. I know if you live in the south, you'll definitely get good harvest of ricinus seeds. But if you live further north, it's been a really cool summer, you might not actually get fully developed seeds. But I've actually had plants in the past self-seed in the garden, so I've left my ricinus out. And come the next spring, I've actually found ricinus plants self-seeded in the garden and grown away, which is great to see. But obviously normally we sow the seeds sort of in early April on heat, and they grow really strongly, really quickly, plant them out end of sort of May, where I live, and they grow away into huge plants. So Martin asked about easiest way to protect Mujabajus. Easiest way is to do nothing if you live in a mild area, or you don't need to, even if you live in a cold area, you need to do anything other than perhaps mulch the ground around where the pseudostems are, because they'll just grow from the ground every spring. Obviously, if you've got a new plant you've just planted in the last 6 months and it's first winter in the ground, there is a chance in cold winter that it might not come back. Nothing's ever 100%, but chances are if you've had a good strong first year or you've had an established clump, you don't have to do anything and they'll just grow from the ground in spring. The big downside of doing that is the fact that you'll find that you won't get huge plants. You'll get maybe, depending on where you live, you'll get between 60 centimeters, maybe up to a meter and a half of growth with the leaves on top, which is great. But if you want a massive plant with pseudostems that are towering over you so you can walk under them, you need to protect the stems. Like I said earlier, I like to use straw or keep them potted or keep them near a house or bring them under cover if you want to keep the stems getting bigger and bigger every year. That's all you're trying to do. You're trying to protect the stems so that you've got the height for the next year to get the big growth. Let's see what else we've got. So James Reed says, I have a Mujabajus in large pots. When they get too tall for the greenhouse, do I need to plant in ground or can they survive in pots overwinter with fleece on the Isle of Wight? You live on the Isle of Wight and it's not a huge island, so pretty much wherever you live, you're pretty much nearish the coast and you're right down in English Channel. So it is very mild down there. So you'll be fine, completely fine, unless you get an absolutely freaky winter anywhere in the Isle of Wight growing Mujabaju in the ground or pots. You shouldn't lose the stems at all. I know other people who live on the Isle of Wight and they have their Mujabajus in the ground and they never protect them. They come through every winter. And a good thing I would do is walk around your local area and see what other people are growing. If you see there's a clump of Mujabaju, or you see an agave americana, or you see some other plants that you want to grow but you don't know if you need to protect them, if they're in the garden and they look totally fine, and then you've gone back the next year and they're still there, chances are they don't need protecting and they'll be, hard in your location. And obviously if you go in the middle of winter and you look and see somebody's protecting their plants, then sort of protect them like they're doing it as well. But you need to really sort of get an idea of what your winters are like. I know it's hard if you're new to this style of gardening, if you're looking at protecting your plants for the first time and you don't know, you've never really taken care, notice of the weather in winter. You just think, oh, it's a cold, wet day. I'll put a coat on. You don't think, was it -5? Was it -8 last night? Will my plants have survived that? Obviously, once you've started growing these exotic and more tender plants, you do need to take more notice of the weather. Ideally, get your own thermometer and check the temperatures. Get an electronic one so you don't have to actually go out to the garden and check it. You can look at it remotely. Go onto weather sites, either the Met Office or Net Weather or Weather Underground, and you can get a map on Weather Underground of your area, and everybody's personal weather stations will be on that, showing the temperatures, and you can look back by day or week or month or year. Go back to the middle of winter, sort of January, to where you live and see what the lows are. Check every single day. And if you see loads of -8s, 9s and 10s, you know you're going to need to protect most of your plants. If you live in an area where you check a few weather stations and it's like, 0, -1 at worst, you live in a really mild location. Or somebody keeps their weather station close to the house and not in the open. So check a few weather stations if you're going to go down that route. But basically, once you start growing these plants for a few years in a certain area, you get to know how cold it gets in winter. You get to know a bit by trial and error if plants are going to survive. I've just noticed the light behind me is extremely bright. That light there is my sort of grow light. So it's my Mars Hydro light. It comes on at the moment It's on that, believe it or not, that is on about 50%. It gets a lot brighter than that. And that comes on for a few hours on an evening just to keep a few of my plants looking okay at this time of year. So not tropical at all, but I'm trying this year to actually grow some potatoes for Christmas. So I started them off probably a bit too late in September, but they've grown pretty well. And they're under these lights just to give them an extended growth season. So if I just pick up a plant, you can see got lots of growth on these. There's no bugs on them or anything like that. And I've brought them in, well, grown them inside because I don't want them to get blight. I've noticed tomatoes and things outside have got blight. So by keeping them inside, hopefully they won't get blight. And hopefully, with a bit of extra light, they will sort of grow well into November. And hopefully we'll have some potatoes for Christmas, but we'll see. But yeah, that bright light might be a bit off-putting for this video. It's extremely bright, but it can get a lot brighter, but it's there for a purpose at the moment. Let's see what we've got here. Okay, Bob asked about Washingtonian pots. I did a video on this a number of years ago, probably 7, 8, 9 years ago now. And this is really dependent on where you live, because I would class Washingtonian palms as half hardy to tender, really. Yes, they'll survive frost, but they don't want to be frosted, really, because it does damage the leaves. Even at -3, -4, you might get damage to leaves. So in my location, in mild winters, totally fine in pots, totally fine in the ground. Soon we start getting -5s or a really cold period for ages, you get damage to the leaves. And if you get damage to too many leaves, it weakens the plant a bit. If you just got that central spear growing the next spring. And then if you get a cycle of a few years where you're getting a lot of damage, some nice growth in summer, it does weaken the plant over time. And eventually it might die in a cold winter. So if you've got it in a pot, it's probably you're in an area where you probably can't plant it out, and eventually you're gonna have to get a bigger pot, and then eventually no pot's gonna be big enough for a good Washingtonia to grow, unless you got an absolute ginormous one, and you've got the space to bring it under cover for winter. You don't need to have it heated, especially. I mean, as long as it's not really frosty, you can have Washingtonia fine over winter. I used to store mine in the garage, so I brought it in a huge pot. It was, I don't know, couple of 100 litres, something like that. And I brought it into the garage. Basically no light, no heat, but it was frost free. And it was fine all winter in there. And then come April, I brought it out and it grew well for several years. You can bubble wrap them. If you want to keep it outside your other greenhouse, then you can bubble wrap the big pot. And if you can bring it against the house wall, bring it under a pergola, something like that, got much more chance of survival. But where I live, it's not a long-term prospect at all. It's the one most commonly sort of seen palms in garden centres. You normally get like 2 or 3 or 4 little Washingtonia palms in a pot. Some people are very tempted to split them as well, which you can do, but it sort of does take them back a bit and it takes them a while to recover. It's better just to buy one with one trunk if you just want a one-trunked palm rather than several Washingtonias in a pot. And you see them all the time because they're really quick growing. People grow them from seed. It takes 2 or 3 years. They can sell them, and you can do that dead easy. But they're just not hardy for most of the UK. I think the best one I've seen, well, online is Dave Brown's in Chalk in Kent, and he's nearly lost it on several occasions with the really cold winters we've had. Without extra heat, you can put rope lights around them if they're not the LED type, they're old-fashioned type, which emits lots of heat. You can put rope lights around them in winter, or you can put a shelter over the top and put like a light bulb, an old-fashioned light bulb, just put a bit of heat on it as well. I'm losing my voice a bit at the moment. Right, have a drink of tea. But yeah, so Bob, Washingtonians in pots, fine short term. Long term, they need planting out, and they can only really be planted out if you're going to protect them over winter with some sort of heat cables or lights, or you live in a very mild area. Robert asked about eccums. So I've grown eccums a few times, and you're playing the game of sowing lots of seeds, having lots of eccums dotted about the garden, and some will survive, some won't survive if you live in an area where you got lots of frost. They find down to about -5, give or take a few degrees. But sometimes even -5 can be too much for individual plants and they might die. You can't really protect them too much because in the first year, obviously they'll grow a rosette, and by the end of the first year, they might be really big. You can put fleece over them, but I think they like the air movement, to be honest. So putting the fleece over them might be a bit counterintuitive because they like fresh air, really, rather than being sort of mollycoddled. But if you get really cold weather, you might lose them. But normally people grow them from seed and you'll have dozens of plants. And you'll find, again, if it's near a house wall or a fence or it's south facing, it's more likely to grow and grow well. If it's in a sort of a shadier area, which they don't want to be anyway, or a colder area or a cold winter, then they'll die. But loads of areas by the coast and in mild winters, you'll see that they'll get through really well. And then the next year, the second year, or sometimes in the third year, they'll put up that big blue flower spike. But it's a bit down to chance. Like I said, some seem to get through well, whereas others don't. But if you grow enough, you'll definitely get some to come through. And then once they've flowered and set seed, you'll find that they'll self-seed all over your garden for years and years to come. And you'll always have some in flower after that period. Red spider mite. I hate red spider mite. So Glenn asked about red spider mite. Gets it every year when it overwinters in the conservatory. Any ideas of getting rid of red spider mite? Well, it's the hardest thing to get rid of because pretty much any chemicals we use, they're pretty much immune to all chemicals you can buy readily, the consumer. So the best thing to use if you're going to go down the spraying route is like an organic spray where it's basically going to cover and suffocate the red spider mite. But most red spider mite sort of sucks the sap from underneath the leaves. So normally when you're spraying a plant, you're spraying from above and you'll coat the surface at the top of the leaves, which is not where the red spider mite are feeding and living. They're normally underneath. Sometimes if you've got a really bad infestation, you'll get them. You'll actually see the webs and they'll go all over the place. You see them on the top of the leaves and underneath and on the stems as well. If you get to that stage, then your plant, to be honest, might be lost completely if you've got that bad an infestation. There is the route, which I like to do for fast-growing leafy plants, which is before bringing them in for winter, so before bringing them into your conservatory, things like colocasias and bananas, you can literally remove all the leaves. I know it's harsh, but if you've got red spider mite on there, bringing it into the greenhouse over winter, they'll just carry on basically if it's heated. So if you remove most of the leaves, or even all the leaves if it's really bad, you've removed the problem there. Then the top of the compost, sort of put some more compost over, or just sort of put a layer of shingle or something over the top, just if there was any of the red spider mites fell to the ground, sort of cover them over as well. I mean, that's the worst case scenario if you've got a really bad infestation, is remove all the leaves. You can also use, I've used baby wipes before, so if you've got sort of unscented baby wipes and you've got a banana plant, something with big leaves that can take a bit of abuse of actually rubbing them over with a cloth, using a baby wipe underneath the leaves more importantly than the top. Obviously do the tops as well, but get under there in all the crevices. And because things like bananas only have a few big leaves, you can easily cover all the surface and get rid of the red spider mite that way. But it's a continuing battle all the time with red spider mite. They'll keep coming back because it's hard to break the cycle, because you won't get rid of every single one, even if you're very diligent. You spray them, you've removed some leaves, you've wiped them over, you'll still get some coming back. So the best thing to do is before you bring in any plants, clean your area. So clean the conservatory out, clean your greenhouse out of all plants, and then inspect every single plant that you bring in one by one and look at it, and does it look like it's got red spider mite? Most people can't see red spider mite because they're that tiny. Red spider mite are not those little red mites that you see on walls quite often. They're something completely different. Red spider mite are normally, to be honest, sort of clear to yellowish beige colour, and they're dead tiny. You can normally see them if you've got good eyesight or use a magnifying glass, or you see the damage of the red spider mite. So it's hard to see them. Obviously, if you see the damage, remove those leaves, inspect every plant before you bring them in. And a good spray that I've found, as well as using baby wipes, is SB Invigorator. It's like a plant. It suffocates the red spider mite and any other sort of bugs, and it also sort of stimulates a bit of growth as well, so plants look a bit healthier after you've used it. It's not the cheapest thing around, but it's the best thing I've found to keep on top of red spider mites. So it's one of those problems that sort of never goes away. And then if you've got red spider mite and you bring your plants out in the next season and it's summer, and if it's a nice warm summer, then you'll continue spreading the red spider mite out in summer. Another thing you might want to do, if you grow something that's hardy-ish, so thinking of like citrus, where it can take down to freezing in most cases, but it obviously wants to be frost-free, ideally over winter. If you know you've got red spider mite on like a lemon tree, then you can leave it out until the first frost, because the first frost is not normally that bad, and it will kill off the red spider mite basically by freezing it off, and it'll die. It doesn't like sort of under 10 degrees really. 10-15 degrees it goes dormant. Obviously down to freezing will actually kill them, and then once you're getting over sort of 15 degrees, they become active, start feeding on plants. So you can sort of kill off a lot of red spider mite by giving plants that are not very tender a bit of a time outside to get that first frost to kill off red spider mites before you bring them in. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend that for like tropical alocasias and stuff, because it will completely damage the leaves if they get frosted. But it's a difficult one. We're always battling against the red spider mites. So what else have we got? Steve Foot asks about keeping all plants in pots, and he's got Tetrapanax rex, Schefflers, pink chinas, etc. Do I need to give them extra protection as they're in pots? No, not really. Again, obviously it depends where you live. But if you're growing hardier plants, providing we don't get extreme long periods of cold, those plants will get through winter. Tetrapanax is hardy. It's a hardy plant. It's hardy down to at least -10, -15, depending on the form of Tetrapanax, because we've got several different forms, but they're all the same species. Some have been found at higher elevations, so are presumed to have taken more cold than others. But they're all the same species. They're all at least hardy down to -10. So if you know you live in an area where you don't get -10, then you definitely know it's hardy. That goes for any plant. If you know the hardiness of a plant and you live in an area where it never gets remotely near that cold, then you'd never need to protect that plant. Potted plants, obviously, they're exposed at the air level, but also at ground level. Frost and ice can actually form in pots because they can go sideways, underneath, and downwards, get that cold from all directions. So you might want to protect plants, mainly the ones that you think might be slightly tender. So in your list of those plants there, Schefflers and Tetrapanax are totally hardy in most locations in the UK. Pink chinas are hardy in the ground. In pots, if they completely freeze through, then you might lose them. So I would bring them against the house wall. If it's against the house wall, they shouldn't freeze through unless it's a really, really long, bad winter. So I would, like I said, you'd be fine. And also if you bring pots together, so if you have lots of little pots, by bringing them together over winter and gathering them up, putting the smaller pots in the middle, larger pots around the side, then you sort of insulating with all the pots together. So that's a good way. And you can put some bubble wrap around pots. It's a good thing to do as well if you know you live in an area where you're going to get a lot of days where it's really, really icy. An experiment, you will sometimes lose plants that you think are hardy, and some years plants that you think are very tender will get through. it's just one of those things. It's a combination of light levels, heat, cold, wind, rain, everything, and how long these things affect the plants. So you've got to really sort of judge your location, see how bad your winters are, and every winter's slightly different as well. A lot of these plants we grow are borderline, so they're literally on the edge. So some winters they'll be fine, some winters they won't. Obviously, hardy plants, they're always going to be fine because they're not on the edge, but most of these plants sort of try and are sort of on the edge of hardiness, where one little thing knocks it out and you get a really cold spell, or you get a flooding, or you get sort of ice penetrating through the ground for a long time, and you lose plants that other years are totally fine. So it is always a gamble growing these types of plants, but if you know it's a hardy plant, then it should get through in your location. And you might see people talking about plants being hardy and you think they're tender. And that is because they live in an area where it is hardy for them, because they live in a mild area and they've never experienced death of that plant over winter, so they call it hardy. Whereas you might try it and it dies its first winter. That is because you live in an area where it's colder, basically. Generally speaking, when we talk about hardy, half hardy, and tender plants in the UK, especially, we normally go by absolute cold temperatures. So we talk about frost hardy. So we talk about plants that are about 0 degrees and they can go down to maybe -5. That's frost hardy. Tender, 0 probably kills them off. So you want to be well above 0. Then we can get ones that are sort of hardy. Call them hardy when they get down to like -10, -15, and then we get very hardy. So if they've survived the last ice age, they've been in the UK, so if they've survived -20, then they're very hardy plants. Obviously, when we talk about exotics, then we don't really grow very hardy plants, really, because they're not seen as exotic. Let's see, what else have we got? So John Sandham asked about 2 foot Mujabaju pup. If it's fleeced, would it survive? It might do. I mean, to be honest, a 2 foot pup probably won't be that. The diameter, the circumference, should I say, of the pseudostem probably won't be that large. So the thinner the stem, the quicker it is for frost to penetrate and kill them off. So that's why an established clump, you might get, a huge, great big pseudostem like that, and frost won't penetrate into the center and it'll survive. So you've had a few milder winters for it to get up to that size, and then it'll be hardier than when it was younger. So a young one, if it's only 2 foot tall, the chances are it's not going to survive in the open ground without protection. Against a house wall, or again, I keep repeating myself, but if you live in a mild location, then they will survive at any size if you live in a very mild location. You can't dry store Mujabaju. As a rule, don't try to dry store Musa species. You can dry store unset species, but Musa species don't really like to be dry stored. You're far more likely to fail because they like to actively grow all the time, or at least keep a bit of moisture in them, and they'll just dry out too much if you try to dry store them. Whereas onsets, so we're talking about onset, ventricosum, morellii, or henebas, montbelliardii, and glaucum, they have basically been cultivated for hundreds of thousands of years as a crop, where they've been dug up, transplanted somewhere else, or they've had a rainy season, have a dry season, and they've dried stored basically by being through drought and then growing again in places like Ethiopia. So they're accustomed to growing like that, whereas Musas don't do that. They continually grow all year round or go semi-dormant in some locations, so they don't want to be dry stored. I know in America, a lot of sort of bigger Musa species can be dug up and put in cellars, basements, and kept that way, frost-free. You can do that, but it's more of a risk. And again, they're not really dry stored because they are sort of normally kept in pots when they're done like that, rather than fully leaves cut off, roots cut off, and fully dry stored like I've shown in my onset videos. So don't try to dry store onset don't try to dry store Mujabaju, because chances are it'll die. How long do unset plants live if overwintered each year? That's a good question from Mark, who basically they will die when they flower. And it can take a long time to flower depending on where you live. I know, believe it or not, I know some onset have been kept for 20, 25 years in the UK, year after year, dry storing them or bringing them into a conservatory, and kept them for 20, 25 years. And they've basically, as they've got older, they've been harder to get through winter because they've just lost a bit of vigor, and they've flowered. And once they're flowered, then they do die. So I find after about 6, 7 years, if you've dry stored them every year, then they do lose a bit of vigor and they don't grow as well as did in early years. So after about 4, 5, 6 years, it's good to either buy a new plant or do that propagating method, which I've shown on my Haniba banana, where you chop it down to the ground, quarter it or damage a growing point, put it on a heat mat, a propagator, and you get lots of little plants growing. Obviously, if you can keep it growing, if you've got a huge conservatory or a huge heated greenhouse, you can keep it going for, like I said, 20, 25 years until it flowers. If you live in a really warm area and you've kept it growing over winter as well, then it won't take 20, 25 years to flower. It'll probably take much less time than that. But when I've seen them being kept for many, many years, it's taken, like I said, 20 odd years for them to flower, and then obviously they die that way. Let's see what else we've got. Best protection for eccums, Robert asked. I've already covered that a bit earlier on in the video. It's basically just grow lots, and if you live in a mild location, they'll all survive. If you don't live in a very mild location, in mild winters, they'll survive. In cold winters, you'll find some in ideal spots will survive and some will die off. You can't really protect them very easily because they don't like being covered in fleece because they like the airflow. Can you overwinter Miscella Lacercarpa in the garden? Yes, you can. It is got some hardiness to it. It's not super hardy, and I've found when I've left it in the ground in the past, it just takes forever in spring to get going again. So I like to just grow them in pots. They're great as pot plants because they don't get big. They're not a massive plant. They'll get loads of different stems coming out and sort of get more of like a shrubby banana if you let them grow naturally. And in a big pot, they're great because you can bring them under cover, keep them ticking over winter, and then in spring put them out pretty early on, and they'll get into active growth earlier than if you left them in the ground. Having said that, as I've always said, if you live in a location where you get very mild winters, if you live in the south where your springs come earlier, because you don't forget, if you live in the south, especially the southwest, spring arrives a month to 6 to 8 weeks earlier than it does in Scotland. You get longer days earlier, therefore you've got more time for plants to be growing and get into active growth earlier, getting out of dormancy. Even if the temperatures aren't too different, you might get spring days of 15 degrees in the south and you might get sort of 12, 13 degrees in the north, so not too much cooler. Because you've got more hours of sunlight or minutes of sunlight extra every day, then you just find that plants can start to grow earlier, and it's easy to overwinter them that way if you live in the south. So there's a big advantage of living in the southwest for light levels especially, as well as early springs. So Lacercarpa is one where I don't like to keep it in the ground because it's harder to get going in spring, but it's hardy down to -7, 8-ish with a bit of protection. Some people do leave them out and they grow fine because they don't die off in winter, and they'll grow well because they live in the south and they'll grow fine. In the north, it's just more of a struggle. So that's why I grow them in pots, and I've had them flower, and the flowers are fantastic. And again, once they're flowered, the main stem dies and you've got all the pups around the side which will grow into new plants and can be divided. So if you plan to do yours out in the garden, again, it depends on where you live, whether or not you might think of digging it up and bringing it in, protecting in situ, or leaving it out with no protection if you live in a very mild area. So, I mean, a big thing about growing exotic plants is you also need to become a weather person as well. You need to check out your climate, like I mentioned earlier. Look at the forecasts. Look in advance. You get a 2-week forecast normally, which is not very reliable, but it gives you a bit of indication if frosts are coming. And check that out. And then as you get closer to the time, day by day, look. If it sets in where it's got zeros across the piece, and you know you need to start protecting your plants. And look, like I said, look historically, last few years in your area, and look at the ultimate lows and how cold the average means are as well in your area by going on to like Weather Underground for doing so, and Net Weather as well. And you need to be, like I said, you do need to learn about the weather as well as learn about plants, because they go hand in hand when you're growing these tender plants that are sort of on the edge of hardiness. So Martin asks about colocasia black stem, which could be several different colocasias like Black Magic and Diamond Head and Coal Miner and things like that. They are tender. You can't leave them in the ground and they won't come back in the UK. They don't produce big enough food reserves like a bulb at ground level to get through winter. In the America or continental climates where they might get cold winters, but they get proper heat for months in summer, they'll build up bigger food reserves, you'll get bigger clumps, and with adequate protection of straw and leaves over winter, they will come back in spring. In the UK, it's never going to happen with a Black Magic or anything like that. They're far too tender and they'll die at the first sign of frost, so you need to bring them in as houseplants. So pink china is completely different kettle of fish. It's very hardy, especially if you give it some protection in the ground. So Frog Paradise asks about polytunnels. So I'll state here now, I've never had a real polytunnel. I've had those sort of big sort of plastic PVC greenhouses with the metal pipes in them that are a bit flimsy. And obviously I've had greenhouses as well, but never a polytunnel. Heating them, again, it's difficult because chances are if you've got a polytunnel, it's going to be big. And you don't want to heat a huge space if you're only trying to overwinter a few plants. So you want to section it off to keep plants that are really tender or need to be frost-free in one area, and then let the rest of the polytunnel just be ambient temperatures. So putting a sheet of bubble wrap a section down your polytunnel and just heating one section is the best way of doing so. So you can do that with an electric heater or a gas heater, or people do use paraffin to keep things frost-free, but I hate paraffin heaters because you've got to keep putting fuel in. Remember to keep the wick nice and low and lit, and they give off so much water vapor, moisture, that it makes everything wet in there. So I don't like using paraffin heaters. You can use gas heaters, which are really good, as long as you've got a thermostat to control them. But obviously the price of gas has gone up a lot, so that might be a bit more difficult, more expensive. Electric heaters are expensive. All heaters are going to be expensive if you're keeping things well above frost-free, because you're using a lot of energy, basically. Obviously, if you've got radiators, part of your house, your central heating, that's going to be the cheapest option. But the chances are you want to heat plants at night where you don't want to heat your house. You want to heat your house normally in the daytime rather than nighttime, and vice versa with a greenhouse or polytunnel. And polytunnels, you've got to be wary of the fact that they're a little bit less robust than a greenhouse. So in winter gales, you might get splitting potentially, you might get sagging, and you can get a lot more moisture running off them as well. So you have to be careful with heating them. So like I said, I've not had a polytunnel myself, but I know people who do section them off so that heating the full space, because obviously the plastic on a polytunnel is extremely thin and heat goes through that really, really easily. So it costs a lot more to heat a polytunnel than a greenhouse that's been bubble wrapped, or you've got a polycarbonate greenhouse which can insulate it. So yeah, check out other people's advice on heating polytunnels, and probably, like I said, don't heat it all unless you want to spend a lot of money. So James Horton, hi, you ask about smallish Sheffield Taiwaniana, Tetrapanax agave, Pseudopanax unheated greenhouse in Derbyshire. Thoughts on unheated greenhouses for overwintering? All an unheated greenhouse will do is stop moisture, stop rain on your plants. It's not going to make it any warmer in an unheated greenhouse than in the grounds and outside. It's going to be the same temperature. Yes, if it's sunny, even in winter, it will heat up much more in a greenhouse than it will outside. So you'll have that balancing effect where you get cold at night, but it'll warm up quicker in the greenhouse in the day than it would in the ground, so that you're going to protect that way by getting that frost off your plants quicker. But you'll find that it's not generally any warmer, especially on cloudy days. In winter, we get loads of cloudy, wet, miserable days. And it's going to be the same temperature in your greenhouse as outside if it's completely unheated. But the plants you've got, Sheffilas, again, Tetrapanax, agaves, depending on agave, should be fine. Pseudopanax, again, depending on the species, should be fine. But you say you live in Derbyshire. Derbyshire can be absolutely freezing, especially higher up in the peaks and stuff. And you can be some of the coldest places in the UK. Some places in Derbyshire do regularly get every winter down to -10 very easily. And those plants, Tetrapanax will be fine probably, but your agaves are definitely going to struggle. And your Sheffilas might even struggle a little bit if it's in a pot and it's frozen through for weeks as well. So if you can give it some heat, brilliant. If you can't and you're not living up in the high peaks of Derbyshire, then those plants probably be okay. As long as it's sunny, if you've got your greenhouse in a shady area in winter, it never sees the sun, it's going to be freezing in there, to be honest. You want sun on a greenhouse, especially in winter, just to heat it up. So it might be, depending on your species of agaves, it's going to be touch and go on those over winter in Derbyshire. Let's have a look what else we've got. Tubular heaters in my conservatory, trigger at 9 degrees. Is it worth putting bubble wrap under the polycarbonate roof to retain the heat? I mean, it does help, but you're losing light levels. Polycarbonate roofs naturally have insulation qualities like bubble wrap, especially if it's a conservatory. It's going to be that thick, probably triple layered polycarbonate. So that is trapping air in several different layers already, which is the same as doing bubble wrap. So if I was doing that, I wouldn't add bubble wrap to my conservatory roof. There should be enough heat retained in your conservatory with your 9-degree thermostat to keep plants ticking over quite nicely. I've actually just installed a couple of tubular heaters in my greenhouse because I've got a big fan heater which blows air around and it heats the air. As soon as it ticks off, it does sort of quickly cool down, and you do get cold spots. It doesn't blow around everywhere and equally. You'll get heated in the middle the most, and then at the edges behind plants you'll get cold spots. So I put 2 tubular heaters on the walls where it's the coldest, just to give a bit of ambient heat in those areas as well. Obviously you live in Glasgow, so you're going to get colder winters than where I live, and obviously colder winters than down south. But if you've got your tubular heaters coming on at 9 degrees, that's definitely frost free, so most plants will be fine at that temperatures. Foxglove tree. So David Joyce asked about his foxglove tree, clump, 3 or 4 stems. So I'm assuming it's one plant and it's got 3 or 4 big stems. Basically, you can keep it like that and you don't need to prune it at all. But if you want the biggest leaves, then what you do is in spring, soon as you see the buds emerging near the base of the plant, you let one of those grow to do a big stem and you cut or rub off the other growth points. So in spring, if you've got 3 or 4 big stems now, then over winter into next spring, should I say, cut them basically off. So you've just got the stump at the ground level if it's an established plant of Paulownia. And then you can let one stem, a new stem develop, and that will get the biggest leaves and the most vertical plant you can get. You can leave it as multi-stemmed, or you can even leave one big stem going one year and get it into a massive tree in future years. but it'll never get huge leaves after the first year if you just leave it like that. It'll just grow into a nice big tree. The flowers are very early on in the year, and because it's a big plant, they're really high up and you can't really see them very well in most places. So for the biggest leaves, with like a lot of plants, you cut them down, have 1 or 2 growth points and let them grow, and you get the nice big leaves. Paul asked about cannas. I've talked about cannas early on, so if you watch this video back tomorrow, you'll see the bit about cannas, and I've also got my 4 methods for overwintering canna video to check out as well. Simplified Gardening asked about baju and Cavendish bananas. Mujabaju we've talked about, and the hardy. Cavendish is definitely not hardy. If it's in a container, you need to keep it growing over winter. If you've got it in the ground, dig it up as soon as you can, get it in a pot and bring it inside. Because soon as temperatures are going below 10 degrees, which they sort of are now at night time, then first of all, the plant will go dormant. And if a Cavendish stays dormant for too long, it will rot away and die. And obviously, if it gets a frost, then you kill all the foliage as well. So you don't want them to go dormant because they will eventually die off over winter. So Cavendish, you want to keep it above 15 degrees. Yes, it can dip down to 10 degrees, but you want to keep it above 15. Ideally, keep it growing around 18 degrees and above, and then it will be happy, get through winter, and then it will grow away next year. But it's a tender plant. It's very commonly sold. Quite often you'll see plants just labelled Musa, and you'll probably think it's Mujabaju, but it might be Musa Cavendish if you've got those like wine-stained reddish patches on the leaves. They are hopelessly tender, so you can't leave them out anywhere in the UK. Nowhere in the UK can you get a Cavendish in the ground, the open ground, to survive all winter, unless you can prove me wrong. We're nearly coming to the end of the stream because we've been going just over an hour now, and I'm losing my voice a bit, so I'll try to get through these questions and then we'll call it a night. Olives, really hardy, so they don't like cold winds in winter. They can often defoliate if they get really icy northern winds, can defoliate them in really exposed locations. But the actual plants can get easily down to -10 and lower, and they'll sail through in the ground. In a big pot, they'll be fine as well if it's one of those old established plants. Yeah, they're pretty much hard as long as they don't get solid frozen for weeks at a time, or they desiccate by really cold, dry winds. Cordylines can be left out over winter. I mean, cordylines are going to grow big and tall anyway, so eventually they're going to be outside. Green ones, so Cordyline australis, is, we can still call it not very, very hardy, but it is hardy down to -10 without issue. Yes, the winter of 2010 killed most of the cordylines across the country down to the ground. Most did pop from the ground, but the main stem was killed off. But -8 and the fine Cordyline australis. So most of the UK, 9 out of 10 winters, they are hardy and will continue growing. Red cordylines are different. They are not as hardy. You'll get a few come through in city centre locations, south coast, the usual suspects, inner city of London. The rest of the UK, it's a gamble. Most winters will get through and can look a bit tatty if it gets down to lower than -5. If you get a really mild winter where it's -1 to -5, they'll be totally fine. Getting lower than -5 or staying around -5 for any length of time, it might see them off, so they're not as hardy as the green cordylines. Is it expensive to heat a greenhouse during winter? It's going to be expensive to heat anywhere in winter with the cost of gas going up absolutely loads soon. So yeah, the cost of heating a greenhouse can be very expensive because you are basically heating a space that is not generally well insulated. If you've got a glass greenhouse, even if you bubble wrap it, it's nowhere near as insulated as a house where you've got thick, proper insulation, you've got cavity walls. and you've got obviously furnishings like carpets and things like that as well, giving a bit more insulation. So in a greenhouse, you are basically spending lots of money heating the space and trying to keep your plants alive through by heating them basically. And it's expensive. I mean, if you think how much electricity costs, it will vary across the different countries, but I think a unit of electricity is about 15 to 18 pence per kilowatt hour. And if you've got a kilowatt heater on for an hour, it's costing that much. So say 15 pence. And if it's on for 4 hours a day, so that's going to be 60 pence a day. And then you can see that you can rack it up over the weeks over winter. You can easily be looking at a few £100s over winter to heat a greenhouse. But if you're just keeping it frost free, you've got some insulation, then it's not going to cost that much at all. And if you've got mild winters and you've got it in a sunny location to heat it up in the daytime, it's going to not cost half as much as that at all. So keeping things frost free, so 5-degree thermostat rather than letting it go up to 10-15 degrees, will be a lot cheaper than letting it go up to 15 degrees. So 5 degrees, 6 degrees, keeping things just alive if you can, rather than keeping them really happy, is going to save you a lot of money, and it'll slow down the bugs as well in your greenhouse. Georgina asked about a 2-foot tree fern pushing out new fronds. When do I stop watering? Basically, you don't stop watering tree ferns. If you grow in a location where it's really moist, you live in an area like Cornwall, like the west coast of Ireland or Scotland, and it's just that sort of really sort of misty area you might live in and get high rainfall, you don't need to water them as much as most of the UK where it's going to be drier. If it's unfurling leaves, it needs lots of water. But even in winter, when you've got the fronds on, before you protect them, if you're going to protect them, it's going to dry out really quickly anyway, even in winter. So you do need to water them through winter. Less in winter than summer, obviously. In summer, you've got drying winds, you've got the heat, you've got the sun, and it dries things really quickly. In winter, you won't have the heat. You've still got a bit of sun, but you've still got the winds, and the winds dry things out really quickly. If you planted your tree fern in ideal location, so ideal location is under the canopy of big trees near a waterfall in a high rainfall area, you might never need to water your tree fern. In the natural, obviously, habitat, they're not watered. They will root into the ground. Some people think they don't root into the ground, but they will root into the ground and they will uptake water that way quite well. But they have all the sort of roots going down the trunk as well. And obviously the crown likes to be moist as well. So yes, they'll survive, but for them to thrive, then you need to water them even through winter, provided it's not frosty or going to be frosty that evening. And any tree fern putting out leaves now, depending where you live, they will sometimes not get through because they'll be very tender. Any new leaves of any plants at this time of year, as soon as you get a frost, they will blacken much quicker than more mature leaves. So you might lose them anyway, unless you obviously bring them under cover. So using grow lights. I mean, using grow lights in winter is good for plants that don't like to go dormant, or if you're trying to grow from seed or cuttings and things like that. But it doesn't, I mean, most plants are not actively grown over winter, so they don't need much light at all. They can be pretty much in darkness over winter because the light levels are so poor in winter compared to summer that most plants that are sort of well grown, talking about the tender plants, don't do much growing at all. So yes, you can add grow lights to extend the season on plants and to get them growing if you want to actively grow plants, but you need the heat as well as the light for them to actively grow. So it's not that beneficial to have LED lights in winter unless you're trying to, like I said, actively grow your plants. Okay, we'll answer the last couple of questions and then we'll call it a night, I think. So it's been great, all the comments we've had tonight. This is the first time I've done a live stream. We've gone an hour and a quarter into this. I know we had hiccups at the beginning where we had no sound for most people, but hopefully you can all hear me now and sort of see me in this nighttime blurry bad internet upload speeds I've got. So hopefully you've been able to hear my answers to all the questions. So I'll just finish now with one more question and then we'll call it a night. So we will answer the question about tea lights in a greenhouse to heat them. So yes, 8-hour tea lights in terracotta pots. You can keep a greenhouse, especially a small greenhouse, frost-free by having tea lights and a terracotta pot over them. And terracotta pot sort of radiates heat a bit more evenly and it keeps it sort of warmer for longer. This works basically if you've got no other means of heating a greenhouse or you don't want to spend money on electricity and you're just trying to keep things frost-free and keeping the edge of the temperatures. It doesn't work if you're trying to keep plants actively growing or you've got tender plants because you won't get enough heat from a few tea lights. And obviously they'll last 8 hours, so they'll last most nights, but if you've got a period where it's a really cold day and night, because we'll get snow most of the country for a few days every winter. Some years we don't get snow, but sometimes we'll get 3 or 4 days, and it'll literally be, 2 or 3 degrees daytime as nighttime. And if you're relying on tea lights, you're going to have to keep remembering to go out, put more tea lights out, light more new ones to keep the bit of ambient temperatures above freezing. And you're going to have to keep remembering to do that. And if you've got a job or you're away from home, you can't keep doing that. So yeah, tea lights are good in emergency or you've got not many plants to keep frost free, and I know lots of people use them where they've got no power source for electricity or gas. So yes, it is an alternative way of getting things through. Right, thank you for watching this edition of Exotic Garden UK, your Chris Weekly Live. Hope you've enjoyed it. It's the first time I've ever live streamed. It's gone pretty smoothly. I have lots of questions and I will answer more questions next time. If you think I should do another live stream, I will do so. Just let me know in the comments on this video or in future videos, and join me next time. Thank you for watching.